This week we're reading Parashat Matot, Masei. Sometimes they're read separately, but we read a double Parsha. I wish to concentrate on one particular episode in Parashat Matot. After the opening section of Parashat Matot, which is a purely halachic section dealing with nidarim and hafarat nidarim, oaths, the Parasha continues, Parak Lamed Aleph, Pasuk Aleph, Vayidaber Adonai Moshe Lemor, Nekom nikmat b'nei Yisrael me'et ha-Midianim, achar te'asef el amecha. God commands Moshe Rabbeinu to, the words of the Pasuk are, to enact the vengeance, Nekom nikmat b'nei Yisrael, the vengeance of the Jewish people from the people of Midian. And then adds, and after that you can die. This is the last thing you have to do. And then Moshe Rabbeinu does it. He speaks to the Jewish people, tells them to organize an army, 12,000 soldiers, 1,000 to each tribe, and they go out, and the Torah describes in detail the actual, not so much the battle is one pasuk, but it says that they win, and afterwards it explains how they bring back the shalal, the booty, the loot, from the war, and they divide it up, and they give it part to God and part to the soldiers. It's explained in great detail, including the halachot of how to kasher, how to make the vessels which they had taken in battle, that they should be kosher. From here we learn the laws of kashering vessels. What of course is interesting, and all the Mepharshim have noticed it, is that the command to fight a battle against Midian has already been given in its proper time. A couple of weeks ago, we learned about the story on which this is based, the story of, at the end of Parashat Balak, the story of Baal Peor, the women of Moab and women of Midian as well, who were involved in a terrible sin of the Jewish people, in which many Jews were punished by God and 24,000 people died. And Pinchas had saved the day. That was the end of Balak. In the beginning of Pinchas, God says to Pinchas, Shekayach, gives them Britur Shalom, and then immediately afterwards, the beginning of, literally the day after the incident, God says to Moshe, Tzaror et ha-Midyanim v'hikitem otam. Attack or besiege the Midianites and smite them, because they are attacking you. Kitzorerim heim lachem. They are your enemies for what they did in the story of Baal Peor, or Dvar Peor, and the story of Kozbi bat Nasi Midian, the woman who was the princess of Midian, who was involved in the sin which Pinchas eliminated. That was given in the beginning of Pinchas. But that's it. Nothing happens afterwards. Then the very next parasha says, what things have to take place? I don't know how many days have gone by, but days have gone by. And in any event, a lot of parsha has gone by. Torah time, rather than historical time, much has taken place. The Moshe and Elazar ben Aaron Kohen conduct a census, count all the Jews, 6,000 people, takes a couple of days, which is also detailed in great detail. Each tribe, the families of each tribe, as we described last week. And then afterwards, the process of dividing up the land is again detailed by Lot, and the complaint of the daughters of Tzlofchad, so the exact laws of how the land will be divided up, even those parts which were left out in the original plan, have been detailed. And then Moshe Rabbeinu appoints, asks God to appoint, and Yehoshua to replace him, and the investiture of Yehoshua takes place. Yehoshua is, it's not just a plan, but Yehoshua in fact has received Samach Yado Alav. Moshe Rabbeinu appoints him, and Natata Mehotcha Alav. He receives the investiture as the future but already present leader. And then there are some laws, the laws of the Musafim, that might have taken only a few minutes to actually take place, but it's a lot of Pasha to read. Beginning of our Pasha, you have another law, the laws of the oaths. And then God says again, you should do the war in Midian, and they finally do it. The separation of these two Pashiyot has elicited a great deal of comment. Why is the fulfillment of the mitzvah of the war in Midian separated from the command of the mitzvah? If we look at the command given in our Pasha, there's a very interesting contradiction, semi-contradiction, in two adjacent psukim. God says to Moshe, Nikom nikmat b'nei Yisrael me'et ha-Midyanim. Wreak vengeance, take vengeance of the Jewish people, b'nei Yisrael me'et ha-Midyanim. The war is a war of vengeance, that's clear. The milchemet nikama. Whose vengeance? So God says to Moshe, go out and take the vengeance of the Jewish people from the Midianim. Moshe then turns around and speaks to El Ha'am Neimor, he speaks to the people. Heichaltzu me'itchem anashim latzava. Volunteer, or organize, separate from yourselves people. The whole Jewish people don't go to do it, only a select group. Each tribe would have a certain number of people. V'yu al Midian, they shall go up against Midian. Latet nikmat Adonai b'Midian. It says to give. In English we have to say to take. To perform the vengeance of God from Midian. It's definitely a war of vengeance, but it is a war of vengeance of the Jews or a war of vengeance of God. These are two psukim which are literally contiguous. God says, take the vengeance of the Jews. Moshe says to the Jews, let's go take the vengeance of God. And then the story explains what takes place. There are 12,000 Jews, elef lamateh. Each tribe puts forward 1,000 soldiers. As Rashi points out, l'chol matot Yisrael, every single tribe does it. Rashi points out, including Shevet Levi, because it's a job for the Jewish people, and therefore every single tribe has to be represented, and they succeed, and the Pasha continues. I think that the difference between Nikmat B'nai Yisrael and Nikmat Adonai is very important, and both of them are true. So the Mefarshim say, and it's quite correct, Rashi on the words Nikmat Hashem, after Moshe was told to take Nikmat B'nai Yisrael, so why did he say Nikmat Hashem? Rashi explains, Sha'omed k'neged Yisrael ki'ilu omed k'neged HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. He who stands against Israel, the purpose of the Midianites and the purpose of the Moabites in the story told at the end of Parashat Balak was to attack the Jews. But he who puts himself against the Jews, he who stands up against the Jews, is as though he was standing up against God. And there were Mamarei Chazal which explain this at more at length. Someone hurts a Jew, it's an amazing expression of Chazal. God says it's as though someone has put his finger into the eye of God. It's a direct affront to the body, kaviyachol lahavdil, of God. So therefore, what Rashi is basically saying is that there's no contradiction because it's the same thing, but that doesn't really answer the question. Why does the Torah express itself that way? Perhaps in order to teach us this. One time we say Nikmat B'nai Yisrael, one time we say Nikmat Hashem. To tell us that they're both the same thing. Another Mefarshim express the same idea in different language. Although that's the usual way it's expressed, in a parenthetical expression, I would suggest that the possibility exists to read the equation in the opposite order. Equations are equations. If A equals B, then B equals A. But it makes a slight difference in the way I phrase it. So the way Rashi has phrased it, the way Chazal usually phrase it, Rashi is being accurate here, is that an attack on the Jews is an attack on God. But in this particular case, what I said a minute ago is not 100% accurate. The difference between this story and all the other enemies of the Jews is that Moab and Midian, by extension, didn't actually attack militarily the Jews. The threat that they posed to the Jews was a religious, spiritual, moral threat. They incited the Jews to sin. Chazal explained that this was a suggestion of Bilam, the prophet, or as he's called later on, the magician, who had explained to the Moabites and the Midianites that you have no chance of defeating the Jews militarily, which they frankly knew in advance. That's why they hired him. But he says, and I can't help you either, because you can't curse them because they're blessed. Ki baruch hu. But you can undermine their relationship by God, and then God will take care of them for you. So they're attacking the Jews, but they're attacking the Jews in their relationship with God, which is the singular understanding of this particular battle, this particular thing. The whole story is not enemies. It's not people who want to capture your territory, or you want to capture their territory, and they're fighting you. It's about someone who is attacking the spiritual side of the Jewish people in the relationship with God. So I would at least suggest you could read it. I'm not disagreeing with Rashi, but you could read it backwards. He who attacks God is attacking the Jews. The identification of God with the Jews and Jews with the God is two-sided. It's true. Very important point. We should know that God identifies with us, and therefore, imo anochi betzara. When the Jews are in trouble, when there's a trial, when there's a danger to the Jewish people, God is with them because He identifies with us. But that implies, not just as a truth, but also as an obligation that should work both ways, so that we should identify with God. If someone challenges the rule of morality, someone challenges the kingship of God, what did the Benot Moav, what did they do? They invited the Jews to worship false gods. And then, in continuation, also licentiousness, idolatry and licentiousness. They were trying to entrap the Jews into that moral, spiritual trap. But by doing so, what they were saying is that this is the right way to act. And as Chazal emphasized, the Pasuk emphasizes, a very strange avodah zarah involved, idolatry involved, Baal Pa'or. We don't know anything about Baal Pa'or. It wasn't the god of Moab. The Pasuk actually says in the end of Balak that they worship, they sacrifice to their gods, which I assume means the regular gods of Moab, and then vayitzmedu leBaal Pa'or. The Jews became attached, samud, to something called Baal Pa'or. Chazal explained that Baal Pa'or was a very unusual avodah zarah that was frankly disgusting and decadent. Pa'or means to expose oneself. The way it was worshipped was by exposing oneself, and worse. And you get the feeling that you're not talking about a particular religion that involves idolatry of stone and wood, but the decadence of human beings. It's immorality, licentiousness, wild avodah zarah, orgiastic avodah zarah, defilement of the human spirit in order to worship this particular idolatry. It's against God. It's against God, and the Jews are the way you do that. The Jews are God's people, and therefore the attack on the Jews here was a spiritual attack. So I would face Rashi backwards. That God says, take your nekama, and the Jews, and Moshe says to the Jews, take God's nekama. If you're going to go out to save yourselves, to take vengeance for what happened to you, you're doing it for God, and not just for yourself. But what I really want to say is something a little bit more complicated. Although Rashi is correct that the two are equal, nonetheless, God said it one way, and Moshe says it the other way. Why is that true? So I think there are 2 points here which are very important for us to consider. Why did God tell the Jews, Nikom nikmad b'nei Yisrael, take your vengeance? Why didn't he tell them the truth? This is milchama l'Hashem b'Amalek. This is a war for God's name. As Moshe Rabbeinu said, it's nikmat Hashem. Why didn't God tell that? Why didn't God say that to Moshe? I think there's an important lesson here, which is something which Jewish history has dealt with, but not always explicitly. There is a concept of holy war. And Midian is a holy war. It's nikmat Hashem. The Jews are fighting for an ideal, not for themselves. It's the vengeance of God. It's because there's been an affront to the very presence of God in the world by this terrible thing that took place, and they need to be wiped out. But God doesn't want to tell the Jews to do that, because we know it's true. My chiddush here, what I want to make point here is that God also says it's true. Holy wars are very dangerous. There isn't really a tradition in the Jewish people of holy wars. A short historical survey of the 3 religions that arose in the Middle East and was spread to the world, some more and some less, So one of them is almost essential, the concept of holy war. I'm not saying that negatively. I'm saying that if you think that God's rule of the world is the purpose of the world, and most of the world is sunk in idolatry, it makes sense to correct them one way or another, or to eliminate them. They who worship idolatry, they're violating one of the 7 mitzvot b'nei Noach. They're violating the very basis of the world. It makes sense that they should be by the sword either converted or killed. That's essential in the history of Islam, which is where the notion of jihad comes into the Islamic mind. Christianity had a different start. It was not cynically as in Islam, but reality was meant to be religion of peace. But once they received power, starting in the 5th century, 4th century, once they took over the Roman Empire, so they also understood that it's God's kingship in the world. God's kingship in the world, we have a duty, we have an obligation to spread God's kingdom around the world. And how do you spread God's kingdom around the world? When people are sunk in idolatry, one way or another. Sometimes it's by war, sometimes it's by an interesting invention of Christianity, by enslavement. Either he did it or he didn't do it, but Christians believe that the Pope gave the Spanish king a mandate to enslave the inhabitants of the Americas. And the reason was, how could you do that? It's because it's for their good, because you'll also convert them. Judaism has never, at least not officially, engaged in the tikkun olam b'malchut shakai, in correcting the world, making the world worship God by force. It's just not in our genes. It's not in history. There's no halacha like that. We all know that the dream of l'takein olam b'malchut shakai will be not even by direct persuasion, not even by preaching. It's somehow the Jewish people, by existing, will eventually be a magnet, which will result in in the days of days, in the end of days, so all the people will come to recognize God's kingship in the world. And I suspect that one of the reasons for that is that holy war is extremely dangerous. When people are fighting for an absolute ideal, it sounds wonderful. It is wonderful. But you lose track. It's the source of many, many, many evils, as we know from Jewish history. God is not interested in exciting, in giving the enthusiasm that is contained in the idea of let us fight the war of God. He says to them, Nikom nikmat b'nei Yisrael. God says to them, you should do it because they attacked you. Do it because it's part of your self-defense. Do it because you have the right to return to them what they did to you. And that, I think you'll say that some of you might think that that's even worse. In other words, they'll get really carried away. God's not worried about that. They have Moshe Rabbeinu with them. They have Pinchas in the war will go with them. These are people who have been educated for 40 years in Torah Hashem. They don't need more dveikut in Torah Hashem. They need to take responsibility. By doing it in their own name, they will take responsibility for their actions. On the other hand, when Moshe speaks to them, I think he has a different consideration. What justifies what he's doing is that they're both the same. Nikmat Hashem, Nikmat Ben Esau is the same thing. But he says to them, don't take your own nikama. Moshe Rabbeinu is worried about the danger of nikama, not for the reason that you would assume, not because people who are doing vengeance get too much into it, too excited, but for a different reason. What was the affront? What was the assault? What was the sin that the Midianites and the Moabites did to the Jews? They incited the Jews to sin. Who's guilty? Who's guilty in that terrible occurrence? If you go to take my vengeance from the Moabites, I'm effectively saying that they're the ones who are guilty. And we are innocent. In other words, we were the helpless victims. Victims take vengeance. Were the Jews the victims? They were the victims. God thinks they were the victims. But it's forbidden for the Jews to think they were the victims. They sinned. Moshe Rabbeinu does not want to remove the personal responsibility of the people who sinned in Baal Pa'or from the people who are now going out to conduct the war. Let us remember, 24,000 Jews died in Baal Pa'or, not because the Midianites killed them, but because God killed them. They had sinned. And so you can't say, oh, they incited me. They deceived me. Let's kill these deceivers. In fact, it's true. If someone incites you to commit a transgression, you're responsible, and he's also responsible, maybe even more responsible. So when Moshe Rabbeinu switches it around, God says to them, take responsibility, you're doing it, it's your cheshbon, it's not my cheshbon. Don't do it for me, do it for yourselves. Moshe Rabbeinu says, you're not doing it for yourself. If you want to know what's your reaction to the story of Baal Pa'or, your reaction is to do tshuva. You should say, we did a terrible thing. But nonetheless, the Kama is here because of the nature of the sin. In fact, it was an affront of God. So do it for the ideal. And the balance between the two of them is what makes this such an unusual war. In this, we could understand a certain conclusion that takes place. After the war, two things take place. One is they bring back immense amounts of spoil, of loot, of bounty, and the spoil is they're told how to divide it up. Part is given to God, part is handed out to the soldiers, etc., etc., etc. But in the middle, there are the laws of what to do with the unkosher vessels that they have taken. Very important halacha. From here we learn how to take care of non-kosher vessels. You dip them in boiling water, you put them through the fire, and somehow you kasher them. Why is it here? This is not the first war. Several days or weeks earlier, they had conquered the lands of Sichon va'og, what we call Eva Hayadain, Trans-Jordan. There were pots and pans there as well. In fact, the pasuk in the end of Parashat Chukat, which describes the wars of Sichon va'og, emphasized 3 or 4 times that the Jews settled the land. Vayeshvu, vayirshu, vayorishu. The Jewish people, the lands captured, we know that eventually will be true, there'll be tribes living there, but right away, the pasuk says, they fought a war and they took over their lands. They took over their lands, they undoubtedly found a lot of pots and pans. This war of Midian they didn't settle. Midian is not land for the Jews. They simply killed as many people. They killed all Zachar. They killed all the males. They also apparently met a lot of pots and pans. Why are the laws listed here and not earlier? I imagine that in the 40 years, the Jews are traveling. They might have walked into an oasis, and some Bedouin in the oasis offered them a cup of coffee, which hadn't been invented yet. Offered them a cup of warm goat milk I say warm because otherwise the kli will not be, the vessel will not be unkosher, in a cup. They have to kasher that as well or not drink it. The laws exist all the time, but specifically they were told here. And I think the reason is because what the way the context of these laws in Parashat Matot isn't, the context is not that there is remnants of non-kosher meat in these vessels. The context is separating yourselves from the non-Jewish culture, which is why Chazal learned from here, either Midian Torah or Midrabanan. They also learned the laws of Tevilat Kelim, of the immersion of kosher vessels, which belong to Goyim, but you have to introduce their cooking vessels, have to have Kedushat Yisrael. And amazing, we're used to it, but it's an amazing idea. What am I doing here? It's just a pot, which a guy made for himself. And it's totally kosher, it's never been used. You have to immerse it in water the way you would purify something which is defiled, tamei. Why? Because Kedushat Yisrael applies to our pots and pans. We're separating ourselves from the non-Jews on the very elemental level of what we eat. Obviously, if the pots are unkosher, you have to then also kosher them as well. This is because of we're not talking about the rules of war. We're talking about the rules of the meeting of a decadent, idolatrous society and Jewish society which is dedicated to God, which is Nokem Nikmat Hashem, as well as Nokem Nikmat Yisrael. Everything you do is related to the name of God which is in your midst, and therefore even your cooking vessels have to be, they're obviously our cooking vessels. They're Shel Yisrael, they're also Shel Hashem. Nokem Nikmat Hashem, Nikmat Yisrael, here there's eat from the pot of the Jews. Pots of the Jews are pots which have a connection to God by being placed in a mikveh. That's where the laws were specifically placed here. I suspect that that's part of the explanation for my original question. Why is the first command and the second command and its execution separated by the stories of Parashat Pinchas? What took place in Pinchas? What took place in Pinchas was the final completion and a beginning of the next generation, not in time, the next job. Moshe Rabbeinu has appointed the next leader who will be the leader for Eretz Yisrael. Yeshua's job is not in the Midbar, it's only in Eretz Yisrael. They've set in place the mechanism for dividing up the land. That has no particular meaning in the desert. It's nice to know, maybe especially for the Benot Tzlofchad, they need to know that they're not going to be disinherited. But it's a mechanism for 7 years afterwards. When they'll finish conquering the land, they'll divide it up 7 and 14 years later. All the mechanisms for the trans-Jordan, for the post-Jordan, have been set in place. And the census, of which one of the points of the census is, Bubahem lo haya ish, that there wasn't a single person there who was in the original census. It's the official declaration, this is a new generation. I assume that they probably finished dying a few days earlier, but the official declaration was in Parashat Pinchas. We're already planning and making the actual existence of Yoshua is appointed to be the king and leader, even though Moshe Rabbeinu is still alive. Now is when you have to clean up something that was left over from before. The original generation will not do it because they were not doing things. They didn't do things in the name of the Jewish people. They definitely weren't Nekom Nikmat B'nai Yisrael, and also not Nekom Nikmat Hashem. They were there just to learn and to fix their ways that they had spoiled in 40 years earlier. The new generation has the job of being Avdei Hashem, of being Merkavat Hashem, of being the focus of God in the world. Yisrael and Hashem is the same thing. So therefore, there's one thing left over. It's related to the previous existence. It's a loose end from the last thing that took place in the Midbar, but it should not be done by the generation of the desert. It should be done by those who are engaged on the fulfillment of the mission of making Malchut Hashem Ba'olam. And that's why it has been delayed until Moshe Rabbeinu started them on their course. He gave them the mechanism, gave them a new leader, and he gave them a new a sense that they are already inhabiting, about to inhabit Eretz Yisrael. On the other hand, an interesting point: who leads this army? Not Yoshua. Yeshua's already been appointed, and Yeshua has done an army before. He was involved in the war of Amalek 39 years earlier. But Moshe doesn't send Yeshua, doesn't send himself. Moshe Rabbeinu led the army against Sichon and Og. He sends Pinchas, obviously because Pinchas is the man from the original story. He's the man from Baal Par. He's the man who had done the first Nekama, the Kanai, who had killed the Nasi Shevet Shimon and the woman from Midian. It's old business, but it's being done by the new generation. So Pinchas is the one who accompanies them, and they go and they accomplish it. I'd like to add one thing at the end, which is only vaguely connected to what I just said. It's connected because we're talking about Milchamot Hashem, that it's the wars of God, the vengeance of God. There's an extraordinary thing that takes place in the end of this story. It's extraordinary because the way we have been taught to view the world, it is an incredible miracle, which I've had an argument with people whether or not it was ever repeated, but it's never repeated explicitly, so you could claim that it has never been repeated. At the end, when everything has been finished, so the commanders, Pasuk Mem Het, it's a very long parak, 48th Pasuk, Vayikrevu el Moshe hapakudim asher la'alfei hatzava sarei alafim v'sarei hamayot. The commanders of thousands and of hundreds, come to Moshe and they say to him, Avadecha nasa'u et rosh anshe ha'milchama. Since the beginning of Bamidbar, we've been counting heads, raising heads. Parashat Bamidbar and Parashat Pinchas, the two main censuses. Here is another census, a minor census. We have raised the heads of the warriors, of the soldiers, anshe ha'milchama asher b'yadeinu v'lo nifkad mimenu ish. After the war, no one was missing, no one was dead, no one was injured. In terms of the way the world is run, that is an amazing miracle. Not so dramatic because you don't see it taking place, you have to count. In other words, no one knew it when it took place. It wasn't like the sun standing in Givon. It wasn't like the splitting of the sea. But when you count afterwards, you realize that something took place beyond the scenes. Lo nifkad mimenu ish. And they're very struck by it. So you'll say, well, what happened? Did Moshe Rabbeinu burst out into song? No. When they crossed the sea, Moshe Rabbeinu az yashir. There was a be'er, something took place a few weeks earlier, Ali be'er anula. Moshe Rabbeinu has no reaction. They have a reaction. What's their reaction? They wish to bring a special sacrifice. Or you'll say they're probably bringing a sacrifice of thanks. No. They're not bringing a sacrifice of thanks. To atone our souls before God. They're so struck by the miracle they feel unworthy. They don't understand how it's possible. They don't thank God for being alive. They think we have to bring a sacrifice in order to be worthy of what took place. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, good idea. It's not celebrated like the great miracles of the 40 years. It's simply a point that took place, and I think the point is, I've had arguments about this point with people, so you can take it or leave it. But I think what the Pasuk is saying is that this is actually normal. It never takes place, but it's normal, it's what should be. If you're fighting a war, which is Nikmat Hashem and Nikmat Yisrael, which is the same thing, you're fighting a war not for yourself and not because of this consideration, that consideration, but you're dedicated to Shem Hashem Ba'olam, then there's no reason why anyone should die. And we know that because Moshe Rabbeinu's ultimate reaction is, Vayikach Moshe ve'Elazar HaKohen et hazahav me'et zarei alav b'mameot. God, Moshe took the donation that they had brought from the bounty of the war. Vayaviu oto el Ohel Moed. He placed it in the sanctuary. Zikaron livnei Yisrael lifnei Adonai. It's one of those few things which are placed to be a permanent memory. The Zikaron livnei Yisrael lifnei Adonai. It's a memory for the Jews before God. We're supposed to learn something from this. Something which you don't learn anywhere else. So we don't learn from this, in my opinion, that you should thank God for great miracles. We learn that from a million other places. We don't learn from this that when an unusual miracle takes place, you should say Hallel. We learn that from Kriyat Yamsuf. That's where Hallel is learned from. We learn from here something which we don't learn anywhere else, is that if you fight Milchamot Hashem, lo nifkad behem ish. There's no reason why someone should die. You're all fighting for God. God is with you. And that thought is a terrible thought when viewing the situation that we're in. We should know, though, Zikaron Livnei Yisrael, that if we truly fight, if we go to war for the sake of God's place in the world, for the sake of the right, for the sake of Avodat Hashem, for the sake of the sanctity of God, and against evil, then in fact God is with us. Nikmat Hashem and Nikmat Yisrael are the same thing. Then it should be. We have to question ourselves, how is it that it didn't take place, that doesn't take place? Even one person should not be struck down, should not be hurt, and every sacrifice that does take place, we should feel the loss because it's not normal. It shouldn't have been normal, but such a thing should take place. And I leave you with that thought as we finish Sefer Bamidbar. Sefer Bamidbar is the completion of the story of crossing the desert and coming to the step before crossing the Jordan. Sefer Dvarim is a long book, but it's one giant or two giant speeches of Moshe Rabbeinu on the last day. The Jewish people have crossed the desert, and now they're about to become a normal people. What's a normal people? A normal people who serve God, not other people. A normal people in a normal land, who the land is Malchut Hashem, and the people are Am Hashem, and the identification, the total identification of Hashem Ibnei Yisrael, Nikmat Hashem, Nikmat Bnei Yisrael, the identification of the people whose God's name is in them, has been completed in theory and is now going to be fulfilled in the continuation. Kol Tov v'Shabbat Shalom.